I don't even care if you make them up, because we need to get their message halted. That type of message is doing more harm to the Hebrew roots movement than anything I've run into. Well, no, there's a few even worse. But what goes on is that they can't speak to somebody in a church, because after all, you can't even say the word church, because that came from Kirk, which was circus, and that's an insult. And of course you can't say Jesus, because that's from Zeus, and it's not, by the way. I'll probably go on that later. And you can't say amen, because that's from the Amen Ra, yeah. And you can't say, you can get down this long list of words that you can't say: Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. You ever tried to tell somebody you need to meet you on the fourth day of the week? They're sitting there going, okay, what are we doing now? What do we call one? Is that Monday, the work week, or is that Sunday? Or I don't know how to count. It just gets ridiculous. Guys, we're really, words are for the purpose of communication. We need to use them to communicate. And if a person is not going to understand a Hebrew word, for goodness sakes, don't say it to them. It's not braggers' rights because you can speak a Hebrew word. I had a congregation that I was working with many years ago, and I did not want to teach on the feast, but they wanted me to teach on the feast. And I really didn't want to at that time, because I felt a little uneasy about it. I was probably 26 or 27. And so what I did is I got them a series of tapes by a person that I thought was a good Hebrew root speaker. And I thought, okay, now they're not going to know some of these words, because this guy wanted to tell everybody that he knew Hebrew. So he wouldn't say any of the names of the books in the Bible in English. It had to be in Hebrew. So I thought, well, maybe first I better give him a dictionary that tells him what all these words mean. So I type out all these words and give it to him. And I bet 40 people show up from this church, put them in my living room, and I played them this tape. And after it was all over, they looked at me and they said, Frank, do you think you could tell us in your own words? They had no clue what he said. And see, that's what we're doing. And really, it's just trying to show off. It's immaturity. So that's something we should probably get over. Now, the diachronic analysis, like I was saying earlier, just because sometimes some pagan used it or whatever, doesn't mean that it's a tainted word for eternity. It has little value when we're talking with each other in communication, because that person isn't thinking of that pagan origin. It never even occurred to them of the pagan origin. They may not know the pagan origin. So why in the world do you want to share it with them? Just go ahead and talk how they can understand it. Synchronic etymology, analyzing the word from a particular time period in history without reference to historical antecedents, makes a whole lot of difference in studying language. Because let's just say that today we use a particular word differently than what we did when the King James Bible was written. If you don't know the way the word was used in the King James Bible, you might totally misunderstand what's going on. We're going to look at one of those, so I'm going to just give you examples. But let's think of English today. There's a Lexington realtor over here, a few miles over here in Kentucky, that coined the phrase for their business, "We sell Lexington by the yard." Okay, that's good. That's a good line. But that wouldn't make sense in another language. If you translate it to another language, there may be a difference in the meaning. But it might not have made sense 200 years ago. Let's look at the word yard. Yard, a noun. A unit of linear measure equal to 3 feet, 0.9144 meter. A cloth measure of 3 feet in length and varying widths. Okay, now look at this. Origin, Middle English, yerd. Old English, geared. Related to the Dutch, gaard, which is a twig or a rod. And German, Gert. Indo-European, Gezard. Okay. Now, yard number 2. Have you ever noticed that in the English dictionary, often you see 2 words? And you say, why in the world didn't they just make the definitions continue on? They can't. Because they're not the same word. Well, they're both yard. They're both spelled Y-A-R-D. What is the problem here? The problem is that they're not the same word. Why? They have 2 completely different historical etymology. They come to us from 2 different sources. They're connected today because they're pronounced the same. But look at this. They didn't used to be spelled the same way, and they didn't even have the same system of bringing them down to us. They were 2 separate words. Okay, a yard, a piece of ground adjoining a building or a house, an area of ground surrounded by walls or buildings, an area of land used for a particular purpose or business, a storage yard, for instance. Origin, Old English, geared. Notice the difference. G-E-A-R-D rather than G-I-E-R-D. A building, home, or region. From the Germanic Gart, for garden. Indo-European Girt. I know I don't pronounce these things correct, so don't try to repeat me on that. I'm just doing the best I can. To enclose or surround, related to the German Gorod, town. Russian Gorod. Compared with garden or orchard. Okay, think about this. This came from the word garden, basically, or is connected to the word garden, yard, whereas the other yard is connected to the word stick or rod. 2 totally different histories, but can be brought together and made a joke of today because they're spelled exactly the same way and sound exactly the same way. See, they wouldn't have made that association back just a few years ago, 100, 150, 200 years ago. It wouldn't have been there. They couldn't have made that joke. Today, it makes perfect sense. Today, it's a pun. Okay, these 2 words are not related. They're the same language, same pronunciation, same time period, no diachronic relationship whatever. See, you can't associate words just because they sound the same. If you could, the Germans would be the most righteous people on the face of the earth, because every time they say yes, they call upon Ja. The German word for yes is Ja. Okay, we know that's not happening. I bet you that God does not jerk his head once just because a German said yes. Unless the German said yes to him. He can tell what language you're speaking. He can tell the difference between Ya and Ya. It's us that gets confused over it. So let's not make silly associations that are based on sounds like or even spelled like. Let's see if the associations actually hold up. Synchronically, these words are related because of their pronunciation, and that's all. What about the word prevent? Keep something from happening or arising. Action must be taken. Prevent further accidents. Right? However, Prevent was used in the King James Bible. And did you know it really had nothing to do with that? Archaic, it meant to go before with some spiritual guidance and help. Okay, prevent. Before it happened, he went. Okay, so that's what we're dealing with. Here we have 400 years, a little bit, since the making of the King James Bible, and the term in English doesn't even communicate. Have you ever heard a sermon on the word about prevent and had them misusing it? A lot of your King James only churches will do that. They want to use the King James, but they haven't studied the language, and so they really don't know what it's meaning. We've got to be careful that we don't make mistakes like this. Let's do that. Let's just look at a particular term and realize, or a particular verse, and realize that the breadth of meaning, like what we were talking about on the Hebrew word versus the Greek word, even on the English word, there is a difference between these breadths of meaning. In Hebrew, the word behemoth didn't really mean the same as our English cattle. And I want to show you how this works, because this is a classic example of missing something. Because we're translating English from the Greek, which was talking about Hebrew things. In fact, it might have even been originally Hebrew. We don't know for certain. I kind of doubt it with Luke, but we'll try it. Now it happened as he went into the house of one of the rulers of the Pharisees to eat bread on the Sabbath, that they watched him closely. And behold, there was a certain man before him who had dropsy. And Jesus answering spoke to the lawyers and Pharisees, saying, Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? But they kept silent. And he took him and healed him, and let him go. Then he answered them, saying, Which of you, having a donkey or an ox that has fallen into a pit, will not immediately pull him out on the Sabbath day? Now, do you all see anything strange about this story? Let me tell you, first of all, he went into somebody's house to eat. And then he asked a bunch of lawyers about whether or not he could heal somebody who was there. You mean to tell me that everybody was running around with a bunch of lawyers in their house? Ask somebody over for dinner? Let's ask the lawyers so we can just settle this, you know? Boy, this does sound like the Hebrew roots movement, doesn't it? Okay, let's look at the word bait, because this is what we're talking about. We're talking about bait, most likely, the Hebrew word. Don't get me wrong, I really believe Luke was probably written in Greek, at least when it was put down in hand. It was probably spoken in Hebrew or Aramaic when they were writing it down, and they were just writing down a translation of it, but Luke was a translator. That was his job. So he probably was translating while he wrote it down. So we have the word bait. We got to think. Luke, if I remember correctly, translated this for Paul. Okay, so Paul's telling the story, Luke's writing it down. Paul's probably telling it in Hebrew. Luke's probably writing it in Greek. This was a very common thing back in that day. Paul's thinking in Hebrew. Luke's probably thinking in Greek. So, bait. It's a house, a dwelling, shelter or abode of animals. Of the land of Ephraim, it was Beit Ephraim, or the house of Ephraim. Okay, it wasn't Ephraim's house. It was talking about a much larger picture, a group of people. Household or family. Those of David's household would have been Beit David. Descendants, the house of David. In other words, Beit David included his descendants. The temple. The temple was called the house of the altar, at times, and sometimes it was just called the big house. Now, if they ever translated it as the big house into English, we'd have a problem. Man, all the priests were in the big house, Okay. So, in the New Testament times, there were a couple of schools. One of them was called Beit Hillel, which means the house of Hillel, and the other one was called Beit Shammai, the house of Shammai. Okay, so these are the usages of Hebrew. And so when we have this English word translated from this Greek word, and we call it house, the question needs to come to mind, is it the English word bucket of house? Is it the Greek word bucket of house? Or is it the Hebrew word bucket of house that we need? Okay. There were two schools of Judaism in Jerusalem. One was Beit Hillel, the other one was Beit Shammai. They were both in Jerusalem. Okay. The school motto of Beit Hillel was the spirit of the law. And the school motto of Beit Shammai was the letter of the law. Okay, that might give you a little bit of information there, because there's a little bit of talking about the spirit of the law and the letter of the law, isn't there? All right. The president, Beit Hillel was the president of the Sanhedrin, and when he was president, Shammai was the vice president. But upon Hillel's death, Shammai became the president. Hillel died approximately 10 AD. So he died a little bit after the time that Yeshua came into the temple. Remember when he was 12 years old? He came into the temple and spoke, and they were all impressed. I wouldn't be surprised if Hillel wasn't sitting there listening to him. So, Hillel died around 10 AD, Shammai died around 30 AD. So Shammai was the president of the Sanhedrin during the time of the New Testament, basically. Who do you think had more influence? The spirit of the law or the letter of the law during the time that Yeshua walked this earth? The letter of the law had more influence. And you'll notice that Yeshua addressed the letter of the law over and over again, trying to show them the spirit of the law. Putting this in context really makes a whole lot of sense. There were a lot of times in the Bible where it talks about you Pharisees. Well, okay, I believe that the Pharisees he was talking to were those in the school of Shammai, because they were the ones who were being overly legalistic. Hillel taught that it was lawful to heal on the Sabbath as long as it was done by word rather than deed. In other words, he would have said it was not proper to heal on the Sabbath if you had to do a lot of work to do this. But if it was just speaking it, there was no problem. Now that sounds kind of rough when you think about, okay, what are we supposed to do? Let someone die because it's a Sabbath? Hillel probably wouldn't allow that to happen either, but that's another story. Shammai taught that it was unlawful to heal on the Sabbath no matter what. Okay, let's go back and look at this. Was this house in Luke 14 one of these schools? Let's think about it. Would that be possible? Would that be possible? So let's look and see where he was. Nevertheless, I must journey today and tomorrow and the day following, for it cannot be that a prophet should perish outside of Jerusalem. So where was he going to? Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, but you were not willing. Yeshua was on a journey to Jerusalem. This is the very last verses in chapter 13, and then chapter 14 starts with what I read you before. So he had made it to Jerusalem. Okay, so, wow. We have the word house. And I asked if it was possibly the schools. He was in Jerusalem, so maybe it was one of these two schools in Jerusalem. Look, it says, now it happened, he went into the house of one of the rulers of the Pharisees. Okay, Beit Shammai. Shammai himself was the head of the Sanhedrin. He was the Nasi, the president, the ruler of the Pharisees. And it says one of the rulers of the Pharisees here, so he qualifies, doesn't he? Okay, but Beit Hillel would also qualify, but Hillel wasn't still alive, but I'm sure that his grandson, you've heard of his grandson, you probably haven't heard of Hillel, but you've heard of his grandson, Gamaliel. He was Paul's teacher. And you see, Gamaliel was the other teacher, had another house, so it actually kind of narrows it down in that first line, one of the rulers of the Pharisees to eat. He was going into one of the schools, maybe. Two schools. He's going into one of them. And behold, there was a certain man before him who had dropsy. And Jesus answering spoke to the lawyers. Now, see, most people don't have lawyers just sitting around their house all the time. But if you look up the word lawyer here, you'll see that it means those who studied biblical law. Nomikos, meaning pertaining to the law, one learned in the law. In the New Testament, an interpreter and teacher of the Mosaic law. So this isn't specific as far as the use of the word across the Greek language, but its usage in the New Testament, it's pretty specific, because that's what they were talking about, the guys who studied the Mosaic law. So, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? See, he's wanting a Mosaic law explanation. But they kept silent. Why would they keep silent? You see, he's asking, can I speak this person in healing into existence? And they keep silent. Well, if he was in Beit Hillel, it would have been easy. Oh, sure, go ahead, heal the guy. Just speak and let it happen. But they were quiet. Guess what? The lawyers weren't going to speak because they knew something. They knew if they said, no, you can't heal the man, not only were they forbidding him being healed, but they knew he was probably going to do it anyway, which was going to substantiate that he had more power than they did. We have a problem here. So he took them and healed them because they didn't say anything. Then he answered them. Now, why would he answer them if they weren't opposed to what he was doing? See, if it was Beit Hillel, they wouldn't have needed to answer him. But since it's Beit Shammai, he answered them. He says, which one of you having a donkey or an ox that has fallen into a pit will not immediately pull him out on the Sabbath day? You see, you were supposed to be able to get an ox out of a ditch, but you couldn't get a human who was suffering out of a ditch. He was showing how bad their judgment was concerning Torah. Do we do the same things? Do we make the laws so strict that all they do is tie people up in knots? If we do, we're doing everything that Yeshua spoke against in the New Testament. You see, we make the law a bondage. It's not that the law is a bondage, it's that we make it that way. It's what we say that makes it bondage, and we better be careful about that, because what we do when we do that is profane the name of God. In fact, I'll do a session on that a little bit later. And you'll see how that ties in. Profaning the name of God is being too restrictive. That's only one way. Okay. I hope this gives you an idea of what it means to use etymology. I went through a lot of different nuances with etymology here to show you how it all works together. We have to study etymology in order to be able to do good biblical study. There are other disciplines that we have to study alongside of etymology. We have to study linguistics, of course, and etymology is a portion of that, but it's not the only portion. Semiotics is a part of linguistics. And I gave you a little bit of that, a little bit of understanding that there is a sign, a referent, and a concept. But until we study these things, we are really incapable of making good understanding of an ancient text. And so it would be best for us, rather than getting up on our soapbox and showing how much we know, to be able to sit and study and discover how much we don't know. When we do that, we may actually become humble enough that we can spread God's message. Because when you really discover how much you don't know, you find out that there's an infinite amount of things that you don't know, and it continues to get a deeper and deeper hole of your lack of knowledge, rather than you having a little bit of knowledge and think you have a lot. In our next session, what I intend on doing is going through a word that is used today, and there's all kinds of doctrines that are based on this word. It's called atonement. And we're going to take the word atonement and show you some things that it's not. Because in the way the word is used, it actually ends up painting God in a very bad light. Now, it sounds really nice when you make a sermon over it. You know, you make a sermon and you say, oh, this atonement did this, this, and this. Sounds really nice. And it's most of those things are written to scare the hell out of you, you know, because we've got to make sure these people go to heaven, so we want to scare them with hell. So I'm going to scare the hell out of you by showing you how horrible it's going to be. But in the process of doing that, we make God into an ogre many times. So in the next session, I'm going to look like I'm randomly picking and choosing words. And I'm not. I'm doing exactly what I've shown you here in the passages before, and removing definitions that have developed over the years because they've had added associations due to what this preacher said, and this preacher said, and this preacher said, and before long we have this group of associations that have developed that actually portray God in bad light. And then we wonder why someone says, I'm not interested in your God, he's a bloodthirsty ogre. Let's take about 15 minutes and get back in here. You'll hear the shofar blast, and we'll start on session 8. Thank you.